Hey everyone, we're going to start talking about the second part of the New York State lab, the Beaks of Finches lab. Hopefully at this point, before you watch this, you should definitely watch activity number 3 that I posted last week. It says number 3, Beaks of Finches State Lab Part 1. So please make sure you look at that first. If you already did Part 1, then I'm going to ask that you go back to this assignment, Part 1. And you should, yours looks a little different than mine, but you should be able to pull your document back up. So go ahead and pull your document back up from part 1 so that we can continue working on it. If you remember, it looks like no one here has turned it in. Just double check the green class. I can return them to you if you turn them in accidentally. You want to make sure hang on to them for right now so that you can continue to edit them. If you turn them in, yeah, good. Nobody turned them in the green class either. If you turn them in, then you don't have editing rights to them. I do. So I'm going to write on my actual document here I printed at home. We have already done, we went through page 1 together. We went through page 2 together. I think we went all the way through. You should make sure that you have an answer to question A and B on page 3. You can skip this one and the tool number. You want to make sure you answer this one. Do you think you will be easily able to pick up one small seed at a time with this tool? So again, you can pick a tool and then say yes or no. Do you think? I know it's a little bit different than if you were doing it in class. I would randomly assign you a tool, and this way you would kind of be stuck with what you got. It's a little bit more random, but that's all right. So page 4, you should also have filled in. Either you filled it in because you followed along the video with me and Jen competing, or you did it at home, which would be really cool. If you did do it at home, please feel free to send me a picture or a video of you doing it at home. Again, you can do it with any number of things, including you probably have something in your house that squeezes things like tongs or clothespin or chip clip or anything like that. And you also, even if you don't have those seeds at home, you maybe have some uncooked pasta, or beads from like a craft kit, or Legos even if you have something like that. Anything else that you might have around your home that's hard enough that you can pick it up with the squeezers without crushing it. So we did round 1, round 2, and I believe we kind of joked around about round 3. But basically the gist here is, my copy is not great, but the gist here is that in the beginning, the island, the environment had small seeds. With those small seeds, some beaks are more well adapted to those small seeds and some beaks are not. You need to ask yourself, is the beak on the individual bird going to change? The answer to that is no, it is not going to change. Just like you and I are not going to change depending on our environment. But what you might find is that the birds that are more well adapted to eating that, so Jen's beak, for example, in the video that I showed you before, Jen's beak was much more well adapted to eating those small seeds, and so she would be much more likely to survive and reproduce, and her baby bird offspring would be more likely to have that good beak for feeding. And so those traits kind of carry on through the generations because it is more likely that that organism can survive and reproduce. My beak stunk, quite frankly. It might have been me, it might have been the beak, it might have been both, I don't know. But my beak was not very good, and so I was not able to compete well in the small seed island, so I had to migrate to the large seed island. And quite frankly, I didn't do much better there, but hopefully, in theory, if I had done better there, then maybe I could have survived a little bit longer. So remember, my beak is not going to change, but I could potentially change my environment because I'm a bird and I can fly. I can potentially change my environment in order to move to a place where I could find food better. If I can find food better and I can eat better, I can survive, reproduce, and pass my traits onto my offspring. So that is basically the whole gist of the beginning. So this first question here, and again, my copy is not great, but it says, what characteristics of your beak made it difficult made it difficult for you to get food on the original island with the small seeds? So if you think back to my beak, if I were answering those questions, my beak was the clothespin. And if you used a different beak at home, please by all means use your beak. But my beak was the clothespin, and the clothespin was hard because, in my opinion, it had that rounded mouth that made it hard to grasp small seeds. Now, truthfully, I quite frankly didn't do very well at grasping large seeds either, but that's, neither here nor there. That is what I would say was the hardest part, is every time I tried to grab at it with the clothespin, I had a hard time getting it to not sort of slip off the I could use a little sharper edge to grab it with. Next thing says, identify 3 traits other than beak characteristics. So if you say sharp beak, that's not right because that's a beak characteristic. So it's got to be other than beak characteristic. If you say teeth in the beak, nope, not right because those are, again, all things that are part of the beak characteristics. So you're looking for something here that is 3 things other than beak characteristics that might contribute to the ability of a finch to compete successfully. So maybe they have, here's a good one, maybe they're bigger in size. In general, not specifically their beaks, but their whole body size is bigger in general, and so they can kind of push other finches around and take their food. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe they have really good eyesight. I don't need to write maybe. Good eyesight. Yeah, maybe they can see the food better than other finches can see the food, and so therefore they can successfully eat the food better. What else might they have? Of a finch to compete successfully. So maybe they can fly faster. Maybe they get to the food faster because they can fly faster. They can fly in a fancy pattern or something like that maybe other finch can't fly in. Okay, so those are all things that are other than beak characteristic. Next question says, it is very unlikely that all the beaks within a species of finch are exactly alike. Random mutations and new gene combinations resulting from sexual reproduction are the source of beak variations. Describe at least 3 beak variations that could randomly appear and further improve your species' chances for survival when feeding on small seeds. So random beak variations that could appear and improve your species' chances of survival when feeding on small seeds. So the first thing I would say right away, based on my beak that I felt like needed a sharper edge, would be to have a sharp edge to the beak. So this question is talking about actual beak variations. The question number 2 from the previous page is talking about things other than beaks. This one is talking about specific beak characteristics or variations. So I would definitely want my beak to have a sharper edge because my clothespin beak was stinky. It was like too rounded and it couldn't pick up anything. It might be helpful if the beak is smaller for those small seeds. Smaller beak size in general just might help it to be easier for it to eat smaller seeds. Maybe mine was too big. Let's see, what else might be important? Changes of survival when feeding on small seeds. Maybe the beak could also have a pointier beak. So it has a sharp point at the end. Pointier, I don't know if that's really a word, but it is a word now. Pointier beak to pick up smaller seeds. Drop a comment in the post if you can think of something else that we could put there. Maybe other people will add that as well. Drop a comment in the public post there. So why did beak Some beak types survive on the new island with large seeds when they could not survive on the original island. So think about that for a second. How come, now I wasn't all that much better on the large seed island. I think I'm just a bad finch, but why can some beaks, you think, feed on those large seeds when they could not survive on the small seed island? And if you think about it, it's because those finches have beaks that are more well adapted to eating large seeds. Now remember, it's really important to understand that the beak on the finch is not going to change. So it's not that the finch is adapting to its environment, which is a little bit of a funny difference between saying that it's more well adapted and that it is adapting. Saying that it is adapting would lead the reader of these answer choice to believe that you think that the beak is going to change. The beak is not going to change. So it's important that you explain that it already had these characteristics that were more well adapted, versus saying that it is adapting to a new environment. The finch itself is not going to change. It is what it is, and it's born with whatever characteristics it's born with, but in some situations it may or may not be more well adapted to certain food sources. Number 5, there are usually fewer survivors at the end of round 3 than at the end of round 2. Explain why this is the case. So little by little, as we went through round 2 and round 3, there were less and less survivors. Now again, the example that we did is just Jen and I doing it. It's a little harder to see. If it was a whole class doing it, you would see, typically when I do it in class, we do it in March, and we do like a March Madness bracket kind of thing, just like the basketball tournament. And we see who beats who moves on, who stays on the island, who migrates to the new island, and so on and so forth. So there are always going to be the least number of survivors at the end than at the end of round 2. Why is this the case? And that is because as time goes on and as the environment changes, there are less and less organisms necessarily that can survive in certain environments. So there are fewer survivors at the end of round 3 than at the end of round 2, because after round 2, the finches stay alive but can migrate to another island looking, sorry, I wrote too much, for another food source. Once the finches go to the other island and look for another food source, if they're still not successful, now in the real world, maybe they could turn around and they can find yet a third food source. But in most cases, if they cannot feed on a couple of different food sources, that finch is not going to survive. And again, if it doesn't survive, it's not going to be able to pass its traits onto its offspring. So the ones that are better able to survive are better able to reproduce and pass their traits onto their offspring. So as we get towards the end of round 3, once you run out of food sources, then there is only so much that these finches can do to survive. And that's why there are less that survive after round 3 than survive after round 2, because after round 2, they can still migrate and try to survive on another island. And after that, if they still can't survive on the second island, then they say, at least what we say is they kind of go extinct in this lab, at least. So number 6, explain how this activity simulates, and remember that simulates basically means pretends to be. So how do we simulate each of the concepts listed below as they are involved in the process of natural selection? So describe a specific example from this laboratory for each concept. So how did we simulate variation? Well, in order for Jen and I to simulate variation in this lab, we used different tools to represent different beaks. Okay. How did we simulate competition? How is competition represented? So in order to show competition, we fed, and it's, feeding, we fed off the same plate, which was our food source. That is how we simulated competition here. We fed off the same food source. Okay? How did we simulate the struggle for survival? So what did the birds struggle for? Well, they struggled for food. They struggled for food. Seeds, in this case. How did we simulate adaptation? So how did the birds adapt if they could not get small seeds? Remember that by adapting, we're not saying that the bird changed, but what did the bird do to adapt if they could not feed on small seeds? Well, they migrated to an island, and again, an island across my living room. Wasn't really migrating in my tools, but migrated to an island that had larger seeds. Okay? How do we simulate the environment? Name parts of the environment. So in order to know which environment we were in, we had what we called the small seed island. And the big seed island. So we knew which environment was which based on the food source. And the selecting agent. So the selecting agent here is talking about what determined if the beaks, quote unquote, got food. So the selecting agent here is the characteristic of certain beaks. Of the beaks or tools that made them more or less well adapted, sorry for writing so much, to the food source. Okay, so that gets you through question 6F.